Good afternoon. I am thrilled that Jim Metcalf, who is a Wayland resident, walked into my office and said, "You know, I just came back from a great train trip, had great photographs, and would you be interested in having me share them with you?" And I've always wanted to go on a train ride. Jim tells me he's been fascinated with trains since the age of 4, and he continues to take these rides. So we welcome Jim. Thank you so much for sharing, and it's all yours.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you all for coming. As she said, I've been a rail fan ever since I took my first train trip at the age of 4, and from at least the age of 10, I had a wish to ride across the country by train, and I got to realize that dream in 1994.
Are you
Is this on? Oh, maybe I'm not. What do I have to do here?
We just need to slide you over.
There? Now are we on?
Now
Hello?
try it.
Justin,
Put it.
Is this on? Well, I hear something
Yeah.
out there. Okay. All
Try
right.
that.
Okay. The main thing is, you folks in the back, can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, in 1994, I had went to a conference in San Francisco and had the opportunity to ride across by train. And ever since then, I've wanted to do it again. And when my daughter moved to the West Coast 5 years ago, I thought, one of these years I'm going to do it. And so this year it happened. When I go by train a long distance, I don't just buy my ticket and step on board. I do some preparation, and here are some of the materials that I've used. That Handbook of American Railroads is from 1951. It's one of my very earliest serious railroad books. The Great Northern Railway book I obtained because I made contact with the Great Northern Railway Historical Society, and this man, Dale Paterka, responded to me and told me about his book, and offered some suggestions of points of interest to look for on the way, which I found very helpful. And of course I prepare a set of kind of a personal route guide with notes of different things, and if there's some particular feature that's a certain distance beyond a certain river crossing or whatever, I make a note of that. I've also made use of aeronautical charts, of which I have collections covering the whole country, and I've got a couple of them here that are pertinent. Because nowadays one has Google Maps, so not only can you use that for satellite view and so on, but you can use it en route to monitor how far away is the next whatever. So with that, join me on the platform. Can we have the lights off?
Yeah, that would help.
Join me on the platform in Wellesley, courtesy of my neighbor Marcy Schubert, who took me there. And come on, here comes the train. And we step on board and we're underway. First destination is South Station, that serves the Northeast Corridor and several of the MBTA lines, and the Lakeshore Limited. And here's my train waiting, with a private car on the back end. Amtrak provides, for a fee, transportation for private rail cars. Some wealthy people buy big yachts or jet airplanes, and some buy old rail cars and maintain them, of course, to Federal Railroad Administration specifications, and they get transported at the back end of Amtrak trains sometimes. This particular car has the emblem on the back end, New England States, which was the name of a New York Central train that this car rode on between Boston and Albany back in the 40s and 50s. On the next track, whoops, what happened there? I killed it. Why is it not advancing? I don't know. There. On the next track is Acela Express, awaiting its next run to Washington. So we're underway. There it is, 125, destination Chicago, now boarding. On the way out, we passed the former Beacon Yard, where the new bridge for Commonwealth Avenue over the Turnpike was being assembled back in July, subsequently now put in place. A little further along through Newton and going on out, at least as far as Westboro, there was a major clearing operation going alongside the track, taking out trees and brush, really clear cutting it, as you see a little further west, in preparation for installation of a utility line for positive train control, which you probably read about in the newspapers, following on some recent train accidents. A little further west, we get a view of Lake Cochituate, and the first stop out of Boston is Framingham. This was from an earlier trip. You see the snow on the windowsills. This is one of the stations along the former Boston and Albany that were designed by Henry Hobson Richardson or his successors in the so-called Richardson Romanesque style, with the bicolored sandstone and the distinctive arched windows and other features that characterize his work. Richardson was a personal friend of the vice president of the Boston and Albany at a time when the B&A needed some stations. Next stop is Worcester. The station there was vacant for many years, but something like 15 years ago it was restored, including the restoration of the two towers. There's often a lot of action at Worcester because of the CSX has its freight interchange yard there, and all the operations that used to be in Alston at Beacon Park are now done in Worcester, and of course the MBTA passes through here also. Beyond Worcester is the town of Palmer. One of my railfan friends who's had occasion to go out the Mass Pike various times almost always makes a point of getting off at Palmer. And he says, I've never been disappointed at Palmer because the New England Central Railroad crosses the CSX line there, and there's also a short line railroad, the Massachusetts Central, which is not directly related to the Mass Central that used to go through Wayland. But so there's three railroads operating there, and so if anybody likes to watch trains, that's a good place to watch. Next stop is Springfield, where the 1926 station was restored a few years ago as a multimodal transportation center, including serving the railroad. At Springfield, we cross the Connecticut River. The downtown is just out of the field of view on the left. Beyond Springfield, we follow the Westfield River with many crossings to the town of Chester, where the old station was moved back from the tracks and is preserved, and there's a small museum there, and it's also used for various functions. And if you look carefully at the far end of the platform, there's a railfan there photographing the train. We continue to follow the Westfield River for several more miles, and shortly after Chester we come to the first of 7 stone arch bridges that were built in 1840 to 41 when the railroad was being built west from Springfield to Albany. 4 of these are still in service, including this one. So the best views are obviously from the ground, not from the rails. But if you look, if there's not too much foliage, and you look at just the right moment from the train, there's a couple of them that are pretty easy to see. This one, as you see, was from a trip in cold weather when there was no foliage. Then we reach the high point between Boston and Albany at Washington, Massachusetts, and go through a cut that's about 55 feet deep at an altitude of, gotta check my notes here, 1,452 feet, the highest point between Boston and Albany. We passed the town of Dalton, where the old station is now a restaurant, and here undergoing some renovations. And we come to the town of Pittsfield. This station building, which is, again, a multimodal transportation facility, was completed in 2002. You don't see this view from the train because the tracks are below grade level through the center of town. From the train, you just see some of the artwork on the wall depicting scenes from Pittsfield's transportation history. Just after crossing the state line into New York State, we go through the State Line Tunnel, which at one time had 2 bores, and only one is now used, since most of the route is single track. But what we're looking at there is the unused second bore. And then we come to Albany, where there's a nice new station building that was completed in 2002, replacing a very basic structure that existed for many years, sometimes pejoratively known as an am shack. But this is a very nice facility, and there's time to get off the train and walk around a little bit. When I rode, there was no section of the Lakeshore Limited from New York City because of construction down the Hudson River. So it was just Boston to Chicago, but normally there's a long wait here where the New York section and the Boston sections join up. So leaving the station, heading around the bend toward the river, we get a little view of the front end, and then we cross the Hudson River. It's always a challenge trying to take a picture of a river while crossing it on a truss bridge. In the old days of film, you had to kind of time the gaps and try to shoot just right, but with digital photography it's easier because you just take a bunch of pictures and then look through and see what's best. Then we come to the town of Schenectady, once the home of the American Locomotive Company and other industries, including General Electric. And beyond that, we cross the Mohawk River. We then follow the Mohawk River for about 90 miles up to the city of Rome. This is also used as a controlled canal, although I think more recreational vehicles than commercial ships pass through here now. But there are several locks and dams along the river, and many scenic views as we go. You can see vehicles on the New York Thruway there on the other side of the river. And the sun sets lower, and it's time to rest for the night. Dawn the next day is over the western end of Lake Erie, somewhat west of Sandusky. And the first stop is Toledo. One of the conductors on board noticed my photographic efforts and made a point of telling me that when we got to Waterloo, Indiana, we'd be there long enough that I could get off and look at the station and go inside and take a look inside, nicely restored and maintained by a local historical society. He said, "We'll hold the train for you." So I had a chance to go inside and look around a little bit. And there's the train being held for me. You see there's a few people there that are still in the process of getting on board. Then the next stop is at Elkhart, Indiana, and the conductor was kind enough to open the window in one of the doors, which passengers are forbidden to do, so that I could get some pictures outside. And of course, this one I was just holding the camera out the window to catch the front end on this curve. The conductor pointed out to me that there was a museum on the opposite side of the tracks from the station, and he said, "I'll let you out on either side." I said, "Well, that's all right, I'll just take pictures from the window of the museum." This features a lot of equipment from the New York Central Railroad, including this passenger car set, and steam locomotive and caboose and a few freight cars. Then, on the other side of the tracks is the station, prairie-style architecture. And here, too, I had a chance to go inside and have a look around. Very nicely maintained. Beyond Elkhart, we passed through South Bend and Gary and the industrial south end of Lake Michigan. This is one of the steel company plants in that area. I don't remember which one it was. We catch a glimpse of Lake Michigan. There's not many lake views on this. We're close to the lake, but not right on the lake shore. And we cross the Dan Ryan Expressway and catch a view of the downtown buildings through the haze. And then we cross the Chicago River as we get close to the station. And then we're at Union Station, Chicago, which, as you see, is under some renovation. On the segment from Boston to Chicago, I opted to ride business class and thereby save a few $100s that it would have cost to have a sleeper compartment. But for the two-night trip from Chicago to Portland, I had a sleeper compartment, which I knew would enable me to take an onboard shower, which is nice in a 3-day trip. And I also knew that Amtrak maintained a lounge at Union Station for first-class passengers, which constitutes those who have sleeper accommodations. I was delighted to discover that the lounge included showers. So while I was, I had several hours on the ground in Chicago, and so I was able to take a leisurely shower and change clothes and be ready for the next segment of the trip. The only problem with taking a shower on board is that typically you end up, missing things that are going by as you travel. So I was glad to be able to do that and not have to rely on the onboard showers. And as I said, I had a chance to walk around a little bit, not very far from the station, and take a few pictures. So this is the main station building. And there we are at the bottom of the list, 215 Empire Builder to Seattle. And of course, that's the Empire Builder also operates in two sections, one to Portland and one to Seattle. They have separate train numbers, but it's one physical train until Spokane, where it is split. So we walked down this corridor past all these posters of Amtrak trains, just to kind of get you in the spirit of it. And that 200 years is 200 years of Illinois statehood. And this is my home for the next 2 days. A roomette on the Empire Builder. The way it's set up, the two seats that face each other, the seat bottoms slide together The tops then drop down to form a complete horizontal surface, and the sleeping car attendant then brings out a mattress, a foam pad to put across it to kind of mask the irregularities, and then makes up the bed. And there's a second bed that folds down from the top if the compartment is being used by two people.
How many days does it actually take to go from Boston to Seattle?
3.
3 days.
Yeah, it's an early afternoon departure from Boston and a late morning arrival in Portland 3 days later. This is where I spent most of my time, most of my waking hours in the lounge car. Not like the old days of the domes where you could have a view forward and back. This gives great views all the way over, but sometimes it's nice to be able to look forward and look back. But I'll get to that again in a moment. I like to try to photograph stations along the way. This one is at Glenview, Illinois. Typically Amtrak trains out of a city will have one suburban stop. For the Lakeshore, it's Framingham, and for the Empire Builder at this end, it's Glenview. I also like to photograph other railroad structures, such as this tower, which is actually no longer used, but in older times, any place where there were intersecting rail lines, which you can see here at the bottom of the picture. This is my route, and along the bottom is a railroad that crosses. Wherever you had a crossing like this, you'd have what's called an interlocking, and there'd be a control tower to make sure that no trains were in the intersection at the same time. But this particular control tower has a personal significance to me because it was this picture from that 1951 handbook that was one of several that fed my early dreams of cross-country travel. So that was the Hiawatha's were among the great long-distance trains of the golden era. We cross the Menominee River as we approach Milwaukee. Milwaukee also has a modern intermodal transportation center. This particular picture was taken out the rear window of my sleeper coach, which was the last car on the train except for 2 private cars that were on the back end. And I was thinking to myself, I hope those private cars are going to Seattle, not Portland, because I wanted the rear view of the Columbia River as we were going along that route. But I didn't know. So moving westward from Milwaukee, how am I doing on time here? We're doing fine. We come along the Wisconsin River with its interesting eroded features, with a station stop at Wisconsin Dells. And then it's time for dinner. Amtrak has good food service. The dining car, I should have photographed the menu just as part of the memories, but I didn't. But they offer 4 dinner entrees. There's steak, there's chicken, there's salmon, and there's a vegetarian option. And of course, you're only on for 2 days, so you can't sample everything. And a good variety of desserts and other items. A little more of southwestern Wisconsin topography here with these eroded cliffs. And then we come to La Crosse, where we cross the Mississippi River. The track runs alongside the Mississippi for about 130 miles up to St. Paul, and actually continues along the Mississippi further than that, up through St. Cloud and a little bit beyond. The Mississippi, of course, is a major commercial shipping route. We stop in Winona. You see the shadows are beginning to get a little long here. And with all the twists and turns of the river, we managed to catch the sunset over the river. One more stop, post-sunset, but not post-daylight, at Red Wing. And then we were in St. Paul. I borrowed this picture from the Union Depot website because, of course, we arrived there at 10 o'clock at night. On the left is the main station building, and the structure that extends off to the right is the concourse, former concourse. And when this was a really active station, the tracks ran underneath the concourse section. The concourse now serves just as a exhibition and function space, and a walkway to get to the track, to the Amtrak platform, which is at the far end. I had long since, I thought, turned in for the night because I needed to get up early in the morning at dawn to continue taking pictures. But I looked out my window as we were at the station and saw this view and thought, I got to photograph that. Well, automatic exposure settings don't do well in scenes like this. So I had to rouse myself up, turn on the compartment light, dig out the instructions of the camera, for the camera, and quickly instruct myself on using manual shutter settings. And I managed to get this at a shutter speed of something like a half second, bracing myself very carefully on the window frame of my compartment. This is one of the highway bridges over the river in St. Paul, and looking up the river in the other direction, the lights of the city. Beyond St. Paul, we follow the main line of the former Great Northern from, I got a mouse here, don't I? From St. Paul through St. Cloud, Fargo, Grand Forks, and then across through Montana and Idaho into Washington State. And then, as I said, at Spokane, where did my mouse go? There. At Spokane, the train splits, one section going on the Great Northern route to Seattle, the other going down the Columbia River on what used to be the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle Railroad. When I started examining this map in detail in conjunction with this trip, I noticed this little I should use the pointer. This little segment here, OT, that's between Wishram and Bend, that's the Oregon Trunk Railroad, and the creation of that involved an interesting competition between the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle, which was a subsidiary of the Great Northern and the Northern Pacific, and the Union Pacific, which operated on the south side of the Columbia River, the SP&S on the north side, and the two of them built lines to Bend, and there was some fierce competition, including destruction of supplies and occasional outbreaks of violence. A very interesting story. So in North Dakota, in the morning of the second day out, it's farming country. I don't know what all the crops are that are grown here, but there are various cultivated crops as well as cattle. First stop in daylight is at Devil's Lake. And then we stop at the town of Rugby, which identifies itself as the geographical center of North America. We have a lengthy stop at Minot, where the locomotives are refueled and there's a crew change. So here again, there was time to get off the ground and look around. I'm on schedule. Had a chance to walk around the train, photograph the head end. And also the rear end. Whoops, sorry, hit the wrong button there. This is one of the private cars that was being transported. As I turned away to go back to my sleeper car, a man standing nearby asked, "Is that your car?" And I said, "Yeah, I wish." And he said, "I'm the engineer." And I thought, "Yeah, sure." Well, it turns out he was just, wearing a t-shirt and looked like an ordinary guy. And well, he was the engineer. He too had been walking the train prior to taking control, just to look at the running gear and listen for any air leaks. And he was kind enough to pose for a selfie with me in front of the locomotive. He was to take us from Minot to his hometown of Shelby, Montana. He said I forget how long he'd been with Amtrak, nearly 30 years, I think. And he said he was thinking about retirement. And are you retired? Yes, I am. And kind of, what do you do in retirement? And I told him I was involved in some civic organizations and church activities, and so I encouraged him to be involved in community, and of course I didn't mention, which is obvious, as an Amtrak retiree, I'm sure he has some kind of travel privileges. So, I also took a selfie with my sleeping car attendant, Tony, who treated us very well. Here's another piece of North Dakota agriculture. Saw several herds of cattle as we went along. North Dakota's other crop in recent years is oil. And we saw a lot of evidence of that. Oops. Lots of pumps. Let's see if I can make this thing work. Yeah, it's work. Okay, had trouble with it before. Williston, another stop. Briefly off the train, I attempted to walk a little distance away, and then one of the assistant conductors shooed me back on board, so I didn't get a chance to do much photography here. There's a steam locomotive on static display that I would have liked to photograph from the ground, but I didn't get a chance. Heading out of Williston, we can see some of the evidence of the recent population boom because of the oil business. You look all across the horizon, and you see housing development. Because of course the people who are doing the oil exploration and extraction and transportation need all kinds of services, commercial and municipal and so on, and so the place has just boomed. From Williston, we follow the Missouri River for a couple hundred miles. Oh, is this? Yeah. One of the points of interest that Dale Paterka mentioned to me was the restoration or recreation of Fort Union, a former Indian trading post along the Missouri River. You see in the background the high bluffs that line the river valley, and occasionally we get some good views on trackside. And we also get close-up views of a lot of freight traffic along the way. Sometimes the freights took a siding for Amtrak, and other times vice versa. Big Sky country in Montana. Another station stop at Malta. Malta features the Great Plains Dinosaur Museum, because this is near the area where a lot of dinosaur fossils have been excavated over the years. Another way to see the West, there were several motorcyclists who paced the train at various times. Come on, this is thinking there. Havre, Montana. Another stop and a chance to step off the train and walk around a little bit. Here there's a Great Northern locomotive on static display. The Great Northern emblem that was on the publicity for my talk is on the side of the cab, side of the tender there, just beyond the cab. Moving further west, we begin to get glimpses of foothills and mountains to come. Stop again at the town of Shelby, another crew change point, although this was rather brief because I guess it didn't involve refueling. And then Cut Bank. The particular feature at Cut Bank is a trestle across the Cut Bank Creek, which I've seen in pictures from the ground, but it's quite an impressive structure. As you can see, we're very high above I'm not sure what the height is, it's probably a couple hundred feet above the creek. Another high trestle, we crossed Two Medicine River coming into East Glacier on the eastern side of Glacier National Park. We were running about an hour and a half late at this point. If we'd been on time, we probably would not have seen this shadow of the trestle as we came across. And here's the little commercial strip at East Glacier, right across the street from the station. I hoped to get a picture of the station, but the station was on the side that was directly against the sun, and so it was impossible. As we get into the territory around Glacier National Park, we get to see some spectacular topography. And the track skirts the southern edge of Glacier Park, from East Glacier to West Glacier. And the beautiful scenery just goes on and on. As you see, with the sun coming in the windows, it's tough to get good pictures, but with the right angle of view, there are some good ones to be had. This obelisk marks summit, 5,200 feet approximately, the high point between Chicago and the West Coast. This is the lowest of the passes on the major transcontinental route. The Santa Fe went through Raton Pass in southern Colorado. Union Pacific went over Sherman Hill in Wyoming, and the Denver Rio Grande Western through the Moffett Tunnel are all higher than this. More views of the mountains as we go down the west side. And I have to say, I think this is every bit as spectacular as the ride on the California Zephyr going through the Rockies. Another view of the front end as we go through some of the turns. There were several snow sheds, reflecting the fact that snow is a significant feature during certain times of the year. On the west side, we begin to follow the Flathead River for, I forget how many miles. I have to check my, 40 or 50 miles. Always tricky to photograph because you have to catch the gaps in the trees in the foreground. This is one of the well-known lodges of the Glacier Park area. You see all the patrons there on the porch waving to us as we go by. This is close by the stop at Essex, Montana. Further on, some more views of the high peaks. As we've come around now, we're on the western side of the park, and so the sun is somewhat more behind me than it was on the other side. There's lots and lots of beautiful country. And you see the shadows getting longer. Another view of the Flathead River. This is the inn at West Glacier. Again, all the people on the porch waving to us as we come into the stop. One last view of the Flathead River and its sunset. I particularly wanted to photograph this station at Whitefish, Montana, because it's an interesting building. We were supposed to arrive here a little before sunset, but because we were running late, it was well after sunset when we got here. So again, I had to resort to the manual shutter control and lean against the train to steady myself to get this at about a half-second exposure. Oh, we're doing well on time. Okay. Dawn on the third day, we're in eastern Washington, which is an area that has an interesting geological history. This area is identified as the channeled scablands. At the end of the last ice age, 16,000 years ago more or less, it was scoured by a series of floods that came from a glacially impounded lake in Montana, and where a tongue of the glacier dammed a river, forming a lake behind it, which eventually broke through the dam, and tremendous amount of water, like I think 500 cubic miles of water, rushed out over eastern Washington and into the Columbia River. The result is that eastern Washington is this area that has very little vegetation in it. And as you see from this picture, or can guess, I now have access to the rear window. I neglected to say when we were in Minot, I asked the engineer, do you know where the private cars are going? And he said, we're leaving them in Spokane. Yes. So I had the rear window to look out as we came through the scablands. Another freight train waiting for us as we zip on by. Here's some of the interesting rocky outcrops in this area. The track mostly followed one of these channels through the scablands, and those outcrops are remains of a basalt lava outflow, of which there have been many over the millennia. Here's another example of the eroded basalt along the side of this channel. We come down to the town of Pasco. This is where we join the Columbia River, which comes down from the north at this point. And we cross the Columbia River. As you see, we crossed it on a truss bridge and got some trusses in the foreground, but this one turned out okay. That's the cable stayed bridge is the highway bridge. Just down the river from Pasco is a narrow section of the Columbia Valley that's called the Wallula Gap. And in those glacial floods, the water backed up at this point and is thought to have taken something like 4 days to come through this. It pooled in a big basin around the town of Pasco. These rise to several hundred feet above the river. And interesting layering of the rock. The basalt intervening with intervening layers of sedimentary material. Same thing on the other side of the river. Just fascinating topography. And a little bit of avian life along the river. This is one of several dams for hydropower. This is an interstate highway crossing the river. One lane on the old truss bridge in the background and the other lane on the new concrete bridge in the foreground. This is big fruit growing country. I don't know what this particular orchard is, but apples, pears, grapes for wine, a lot of that activity in this area. And wind power. At several points along the river, we saw these float lines, obviously supporting fishing nets, and some of them being tended by people in these small boats. And one of my fellow passengers explained that these are members of native tribes who have fishing rights in the river. One of many cuts along the way with rockfall warning fence along the side, not to contain the rock, but just to trip a signal if one of those wires is broken. One of many views of the river as we come into the Columbia Gorge scenic area. Another rock cut with rock warning fences on both sides. First view of Mount Hood coming around a bend of the river. I'm back in the lounge car at this point taking a picture out the side, but I was kind of back and forth between the two locations. The Columbia, too, is a major commercial shipping route. This is a fire scar from a fire last year, not the big one that was down toward Bonneville Dam. This is a smaller fire. But the downstream end on the right is a very sharp line, because that's apparently where the firefighters were able to take a stand and contain it. Another orchard. And another freight with logs stacked there on the side for awaiting transportation. More views of the river. It's just spectacular. One spectacular view after another. It's impressive. This is the junction with that Oregon Trunk Railroad that I mentioned, which crosses the river at this point. And then it goes up the valley of the Deschutes River toward Bend, Oregon. This is the highway crossing just downstream from Wishram to the town of the Dalles in Oregon. And this is the town of the Dalles. It's a major kind of tourist destination town. As you see, there's a riverboat there. One of several opportunities to see the Columbia by boat. A view of Mount Hood from the Dalles. Another freight train that we passed on the way. Another pile of logs awaiting transport. There are several tunnels along this route, and I kept trying to get a good set of photographs, and eventually got a decent set. They're all very short through these kind of what must be tongues of lava that had flowed out and kind of partially filled the river valley. And the interstate highway through the Columbia is on the south side, and there's a two-lane road that goes along the north side, sometimes closely paralleling the track. This is my favorite picture from the whole trip. I could just kind of look at this picture forever. As we get down toward the broader valley approaching Portland, there's some long sections of straight track. A couple of miles or more here. Looking across to the other side, get a glimpse of the Portland airport. We come to the town of Vancouver, Washington, where on the left is the track coming in from Seattle, and on the right is the track coming in from Spokane down the Columbia Valley. Then we cross the Columbia, and through the North Portland Freight Yard. And we are at destination, Union Station, Portland. Through the waiting room, and we're on the ground. And I thank you for taking the trip with me. Questions, comments, anything? Yes.
How did you come back?
By plane. Yeah. I was, my wife flew out. She doesn't like long distance train rides, and so we flew back together.
How many people are on the train?
How many? Gosh, I don't know.
Is it a lot or a few? Or?
It was pretty well filled. They have two sleeper cars that go to Seattle, and one that goes to Portland. Two coaches that go to each destination, and there's got to be several hundred people on the train.
These aren't just commuters going to work.
No. Yes.
What camera did you shoot with, and what lens?
Oh, a Nikon. I could have brought it with me. A Nikon D3100 with a